The three most dangerous men in the city were standing in the rain. Not hiding, not waiting for a fight, just standing, silent, under a flickering bus shelter at midnight, in a harbor district that most people avoided after dark. Three brothers who had spent 15 years building something that governments feared and rivals refused to name out loud were doing nothing. That was the strange part. Men like the Valerick brothers did not stand still without a reason. They did not wait. They did not go unprotected into wet, empty streets in the middle of the night without a vehicle nearby and a plan already running. But tonight they were here. And tonight there was no plan. Just the rain, and the dark, and the low hum of the harbor moving somewhere beyond the buildings. And then, out of nowhere, out of the dark, out of the kind of night that was supposed to hold nothing good, a small boy appeared, red hair soaked flat against his forehead. A cheap plastic umbrella fighting the wind above his head. A backpack too big for his shoulders. And eyes that were not afraid. He looked up at all three of them. And he asked the last question anyone expected. Are you also waiting for someone? The rain hit the pavement like it had a grudge. Not soft rain. Not drizzle. The kind of rain that soaks through your coat in 30 seconds and doesn't apologize for it. Harbor Street was empty. The transit lights above the bus shelter buzzed and flickered, half of them already dead, casting a sick yellow glow over the wet concrete below. Three men stood beneath that shelter, still, silent, the kind of still that didn't come from patience, came from control, from years of training themselves not to move unless they meant it. Zion Valerick stood on the left, the tallest of the three by half an inch. His jaw was tight. His dark eyes swept the street in slow, calculated arcs like a man who had spent his whole life watching exits. Malachi Valerick stood in the middle, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He had the kind of face that made men nervous in boardrooms and worse places. Sharp cheekbones, a mouth that rarely smiled and meant it even less. Darius Valerick stood on the right, the youngest by 4 minutes. He leaned against the wall of the shelter with his hands in his coat pockets, watching the rain fall in sheets across the harbor road. Something about the night was sitting wrong with him, and he couldn't name it yet. They were waiting for a contact who was already 40 minutes late. That was unusual. Their contacts were never late. Zion checked his phone. No message. No call. He put it away without expression. Malachi exhaled slowly through his nose. Darius kept watching the rain. That's when the small figure appeared at the edge of the shelter's dim light. He came out of the dark like the rain had just put him there. A boy. Couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old. He had bright red hair, the kind of red that looked almost orange under certain lights, and it was soaked flat against his forehead. His sneakers were wet through. His backpack sagged on his narrow shoulders. But he was holding a cheap plastic umbrella above his head with both hands, doing its best to protect him while the wind kept trying to pull it inside out. He stopped at the edge of the shelter, looked up at the three men, didn't flinch. That alone was strange. Most grown adults thought twice before standing next to the Valerick brothers. This child looked at all three of them with big blue eyes and something close to relief. Then he said it, quietly, calmly, like he asked strangers this question every day. Are you also waiting for someone? Nobody moved. The rain kept hammering the shelter roof. A distant foghorn sounded from the harbor. The overhead light buzzed. Darius was the first to look at Malachi. Malachi was already looking at Zion. Zion was looking at the boy. None of them answered right away. The child didn't seem bothered by the silence. He folded his umbrella carefully, shook the water off it, and stepped under the shelter's edge. Not too close, just enough to be out of the worst of the rain. He set his backpack down between his feet and looked out at the street with an expression that was far too old for his face. Waiting, just like them. Zion finally spoke. His voice was low and even. What's your name? The boy looked up at him. Kairo. He said it easily, like it was a simple fact. Kairo Beaumont Ashford. He tilted his head slightly. What's yours? Darius made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Malachi's expression shifted just barely, one eyebrow, maybe a millimeter. Zion, Zion said. Are those your brothers? Kairo asked, nodding at Malachi and Darius. Yes. Kairo nodded like that confirmed something he'd already suspected. You look the same. My dad told me about men who look exactly the same as each other. He said they're called identical. He paused. Are you identical? Close enough, Darius said. Hi viewers, have you ever had a stranger say something so simple it stopped you completely? Something that hit you in a place you weren't expecting? Drop your story in the comments. I want to read them. Kairo seemed satisfied with that. He looked back out at the street, watching the rain the same way they had been watching it. Patient, unhurried. Malachi leaned toward Zion slightly and spoke under his breath. Why is a child alone at midnight in the harbor district? It wasn't a question. It was an observation that demanded an answer neither of them had. Zion kept his eyes on the boy. Kairo, where is your father? He works late, Kairo said simply. He told me if I ever needed to wait for him and he wasn't home yet, I should come here. To this stop. He looked up again. He said someone would always be here. The three brothers went very still. That sentence landed differently than it should have. Someone would always be here. That was deliberate. That was a plan. Someone had prepared this child to find this specific location on a night when something went wrong at home. Darius pushed off the wall. How long have you been waiting? Kairo considered this with the seriousness of someone doing math. Since before the rain started. He looked at the puddles spreading across the sidewalk. So, a while. Zion crouched down slowly to the boy's level. He kept his voice steady, calm. The way you talk to someone you don't want to startle. Did your dad tell you what to do if no one came? Kairo blinked. He said someone would come, he said. He said to wait. He looked at Zion with complete, unshaken certainty. So I waited. Something in Zion's chest moved in a way he didn't examine. He stood back up. Behind the boy, down the length of Harbor Street, a dark vehicle had slowed to nearly a stop. Not parked, not passing through, just sitting there in the rain, engine running, headlights cutting through the wet dark. The windows were tinted, no plates visible from this distance. Malachi had already clocked it. Darius had too. Their eyes met over the boy's head. The vehicle didn't move. Then Malachi said it, just barely above a whisper. Quiet enough that Kairo couldn't hear. His voice was flat and certain in the way of someone reporting a fact, not a theory. Someone left him here as bait. And then something happened that none of them were prepared for. Kairo turned away from the street. He stepped closer to Zion. Not scared, not running. He just moved toward him. Like that was the natural place to be. And as he did, Zion caught it. A scent. Faint. Almost buried under rain and wet concrete and the damp canvas of the boy's backpack. But it was there. Zion went rigid. It was theirs. Not similar to theirs. Not accidentally close. It carried the distinct thread of their bloodline, the kind of marker that only existed in family. In pack. In blood so close it echoed. That should have been impossible. This boy had no connection to them. He was a stranger on a street corner. He was a child waiting in the rain. He shouldn't smell like home. Kairo looked up at Zion with those blue eyes, and said quietly, like he was just noticing it himself. You smell like home. The rain kept falling. The dark vehicle still hadn't moved. And Zion Valerick, a man who had not been surprised in over a decade, felt something he couldn't name move through him like cold water. Malachi pulled out his phone. He typed one message, short, to their head of security. Then he put the phone away and looked at the boy like he was a puzzle someone had left out in the rain for them to solve. Kairo, he said. His voice came out steadier than he felt. Come further under the shelter. The boy didn't question it. He picked up his backpack and moved to stand closer to the wall, away from the street-facing edge. He looked up at Malachi the same way he'd looked at Zion. Direct, open, without the wariness most people brought when they were close to them. Down the street, the dark vehicle still hadn't moved. Darius kept it in his peripheral vision. He didn't look at it directly. He'd learned a long time ago that the moment you made it obvious you'd seen someone watching you, the dynamic shifted. Right now, they had the advantage of appearing unbothered. He was the opposite of unbothered. "Your dad," Darius said, keeping his voice easy and low. "What does he do?" "When he works late." Kairo thought about it. "He moves things," he said. "He says he makes sure things get where they're supposed to go safely." He looked down at his sneakers, then back up. "He doesn't always tell me exactly what things." Darius nodded. That told them something. "What's his name?" Malachi asked. "Your dad." "Rowan." Kairo said it without hesitation. "Rowan Beaumont Ashford." The name landed. Zion's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Malachi blinked once. Slowly. Darius went completely still. Beaumont Ashford. They hadn't heard that name spoken out loud in 15 years. Not since the war. Not since the night the East Coast operations collapsed and 2 syndicates went to open conflict and someone, one person, had moved them through the fire when they should not have survived it. Someone who had disappeared after. Someone they had searched for. Beaumont Ashford. Malachi looked at Zion. Zion was already looking at him. Neither of them spoke. Kairo didn't notice the silence stretch. He was watching the rain again, his chin propped on one hand, elbow resting on his knee. There was something genuinely peaceful about him that shouldn't have been possible given where he was and what time it was and the fact that he was alone. "How old are you?" Zion asked. 7, Kairo said. Then, with the gravity of someone making an important distinction, "And 3 months. 7 years old." Zion did the count in his head before he could stop himself. 15 years ago, Rowan Beaumont Ashford had been maybe 22. Young. A runner for the neutral faction. Someone who didn't belong to either warring side, which was exactly why he'd been able to move through the conflict without being stopped. He'd gotten the 3 of them across 2 checkpoints and through a locked warehouse district on the worst night of their lives. Then he was gone. No trace. No contact. Nothing. They'd assumed the worst. Apparently the worst had not happened. Apparently Rowan Beaumont Ashford had spent 15 years building a quiet life somewhere close enough to this harbor district that he could use it as a safe point for his son. His son, who smelled like their bloodline, who walked up to them in the dark without fear. "Kairo," Zion said carefully, "did your dad ever talk about us?" The boy tilted his head. "He talked about 3 brothers," he said. "He said they were important." He paused. "He said if I was ever really scared and couldn't find him and didn't know what to do, I should think about the harbor. Think about the harbor. Not the harbor stop on a map. Not a generic location. This specific stop. On Harbor Street, which was where the 3 of them met contacts on the 2nd Thursday of the month without exception, and had done so for 11 years. Rowan had known. He'd always known. And he'd built that knowledge into his son like a compass point. The question was why. And the more pressing question, the one sitting hot and heavy in Malachi's chest right now, was where Rowan was tonight and why he hadn't come. Down the street, the dark vehicle began to move. Slow. No urgency. Just a long, patient roll forward along the wet road. Passed under a street lamp. The passenger window was down a few inches despite the rain. Someone was looking out of it. Looking at the shelter. Looking at Kairo. Darius stepped slightly forward, positioning himself between the street and the boy without making it dramatic. He kept his posture casual. Both hands loose. He'd learned to be a wall without looking like one. The vehicle passed the shelter and kept moving. But it didn't leave. 20 meters down the road it stopped again. Engine still running. Malachi's phone buzzed. He read the message from their security contact. His expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened. He showed the screen to Zion for 1 second. The message read, 3 known associates of the Carver network spotted at Harbor South checkpoint 30 minutes ago. Moving north. The Carver network. That was all Malachi needed to know. He looked at Zion. The decision passed between them in silence the way decisions always did between them. They had grown up in the same house, walked into the same dangers, finished each other's thoughts before they were spoken. They were not leaving this child at this stop. Not tonight. Not ever, if Malachi was being completely honest with himself, but that was a thought he hadn't finished having yet. Darius crouched down to Kairo's level. He kept his voice light, friendly, the voice he used when he needed someone to feel safe moving quickly without panicking. "Hey, you hungry?" Kairo blinked. "A little," he admitted. "We're going somewhere warmer than this. You good with that?" Kairo looked at him for a moment. Then at Zion. Then at Malachi. Then back at Darius. "Are you going to bring me back here after?" he asked. "In case my dad comes?" Darius held eye contact with him and answered honestly. "We'll figure that out. But right now I need you to walk with us. Can you do that?" The boy picked up his backpack. He reached out and took Darius's hand. Darius looked down at their joined hands for a half-second longer than necessary. "Okay," Kairo said. "Let's go." They moved. The dark vehicle at the end of the street had turned around, and it was coming back. They moved fast without running. That was the skill, making speed look like a casual walk. Zion on the left, Malachi on the right, Darius and Kairo between them. The boy kept up without complaint. His small legs were quick, and he seemed to understand instinctively that now was not the time for questions. The vehicle came up behind them, slow, pacing them. Malachi didn't look back. He tracked it by sound. Engine hum. Tire spray on wet road. The slight shift in the acoustic of the street when something large moved close. They turned left at the corner, cutting toward the service lane behind the shipping offices. Darius squeezed Kairo's hand once. The boy squeezed back. Neither of them commented on it. The vehicle turned too, pulled ahead of them by 30 feet and stopped. 2 doors opened. 3 men stepped out. They were dressed plain. Dark coats, civilian clothes, nothing that would draw attention on a street at midnight. But they spread apart the way people spread apart when they're trained, not instinctive. The kind of spacing that covers angles. The kind of spacing that means they have run versions of the scenario before in rooms and in practice until it became muscle memory. These were not amateurs. That changed the math slightly. The one in the center was wide at the shoulder, built compact and solid, and he moved with the particular confidence of someone who hadn't been told no in a long time. He wore a gray wool coat with the collar up. His hands were at his sides. Loose. Ready. He looked at Kairo first, then at the 3 brothers. Something shifted in his expression. He hadn't expected 3. "We just need the kid," he said. Not aggressive yet. Exploratory. Measuring the room, so to speak, even though there was no room. Just a wet service lane with a broken streetlight and the smell of the harbor 3 blocks away. Kairo's hand tightened around Darius's fingers. He didn't make a sound, just held tighter. Darius didn't look down at him. He kept his eyes on the men and his voice completely flat. "Walk away. We have authorization," the wide one said. His tone shifted. Something colder started showing through the professional surface of his voice. Custody documentation. The boy was reported as a runaway to protective services. "We've been authorized to." "You don't have documentation," Malachi said. His voice was quieter than Darius's, which somehow made it worse. Low voices in confrontations always did. It meant the person speaking hadn't needed to raise their voice in a very long time. "You have a cover story. Those are different things. Walk away." The man on the left shifted his weight. Zion clocked it. The man was going to move in the next 4 seconds. He could read it in the lean forward, in the subtle readjustment of the feet. The way a person moves their center of gravity before committing to an action they've already decided on. It was the kind of tell that took years to learn to read and was invisible to anyone who hadn't spent long enough in dangerous places. He was right. The man on the left stepped forward, and Zion moved. Not violently, precisely. He intercepted the step, planted himself directly in the man's path, and said one sentence in a voice that had stopped rooms full of men far more dangerous than these 3 and never once had to repeat itself. "You have 10 seconds to get back in that vehicle." The man froze. Behind Zion, the only sound was the rain. The man in the center looked at Zion for a long moment. He was recalibrating visibly. Whoever had sent them out tonight had told them the boy would be alone, unsupervised. A small Omega child at a rain-soaked transit stop in the Harbor District. Easy to extract. No witnesses. In and out before midnight. Nobody had briefed them on 3 men who stood like this. Who held this kind of ground with this kind of quiet. Who looked at 3 armed strangers in a service lane with the mild expression of men who had simply seen worse. We were told, the center man started. Someone lied to you, Darius said. His voice hadn't changed from the moment he'd first spoken. Constant. Even. That's not our problem. It's yours. He paused. Walk. Away. Silence. Rain on pavement. The vehicle's engine idling at the end of the lane. Kairo stood very still behind Darius, both hands now gripping the back of Darius's coat. He wasn't crying. He wasn't making a sound. He had simply decided, in the practical way that children sometimes do when they have been raised around difficult nights, that the best thing he could contribute to this situation was to be as small and quiet as possible. He just held on. The center man looked at Kairo one more time. Long. Calculating. Then his jaw moved and he said something quiet, and even that landed differently than anything else he'd said. You have no idea who that child belongs to. Zion held his gaze. Steady. Unblinking. The rain ran down his face and he didn't move, didn't blink, didn't adjust. 10 seconds are up, he said. 3 seconds of nothing. Then the men moved. All 3 of them back to the vehicle. Not hurrying. Maintaining the kind of dignity that people maintain when they've decided to walk away on their own terms rather than being made to run. The doors closed. The engine changed pitch. The vehicle pulled forward, turned at the end of the lane, and disappeared into the rain. Nobody moved for a moment. The lane was quiet again. Water running along the gutter. Distant foghorn from the harbor. Then Darius exhaled slowly through his nose and looked down at Kairo. The boy was still holding the back of his coat with both fists. His knuckles were pale. His face was very calm in the particular way a child's face goes calm when they have decided not to fall apart because they sense, correctly, that falling apart would not help the situation they are in. Are those bad men? Kairo asked. Darius considered lying. It would have been easy. It would have been the natural move. Reassure the child. Simplify the night. Smooth over the edges. He didn't. Yes, he said. But they're gone now. Kairo nodded slowly. He was processing it, visibly carefully the way he'd processed everything tonight. Then he let go of the coat. He reached down and picked up his umbrella from where it had fallen during the movement. He turned it over in both hands and examined it with the focused attention of someone inspecting something genuinely important to them, found it intact, and folded it under his arm with a small nod of satisfaction. He looked up at Darius. Okay, he said. Where are we going? Behind them, above the sound of the rain, Malachi said something quietly. Not to Kairo. Not directed at the street or the night or the vehicle that had just disappeared. Just to his brothers. Low enough that only they could hear it. I think we know who that child belongs to. Zion said nothing. Darius said nothing. Because they both knew exactly what he meant. And none of them needed to say another word. The penthouse was on the 14th floor of a converted shipping warehouse near the water. It wasn't decorated to impress. It was decorated to live in, which for 3 men who spent most of their lives in motion meant it was sparse in some places and oddly specific in others. Heavy shelves of books along one wall. A kitchen designed for actual use. 3 distinct seating areas that each felt like they belonged to a different person because they did. Kairo walked in and looked around. He didn't say wow. He didn't run to the windows to see the harbor lights below, even though the view was the kind that made grown men stop mid-sentence. He just stood in the entrance hall with his wet backpack and his folded umbrella and took in the space with careful eyes. Then he walked directly to the kitchen. He stopped in front of the cabinet next to the refrigerator. The tall one, second from the left. He turned and looked at Darius. Is this where the cups are? He asked. Darius stared at him. What? Cups? Kairo said, pointing at the cabinet. For drinking. Is that where you keep them? Nobody had told him which cabinet held the cups. The kitchen had 7 cabinets. The boy had walked directly to the right one. Darius opened it. Cups. He stood there with the cabinet door in his hand and looked at the boy. Kairo seemed satisfied. He set his backpack against the wall and climbed onto a bar stool at the kitchen island. He placed both hands flat on the counter and looked at Zion. I'm hungry, he said. Is that okay? Zion moved to the refrigerator, opened it, and pulled out what was available, which was, he noticed, not a lot of child-appropriate food given that no one had ever brought a child here before. He found some leftover rice, eggs, some fruit. He started with the fruit. Malachi pulled Darius to the far end of the living room. How did he know about the cabinet? Darius said. Came out flat, like a statement he was still processing. He didn't know. He guessed, Malachi said. But the way he said it told Darius that he didn't actually believe that. He walked past 6 cabinets, Darius said. 7-year-olds don't guess that efficiently. Malachi looked at Kairo sitting at the counter, watching Zion cut an apple with the same relaxed attention he'd given everything else tonight. Rowan knew this space, Malachi said. He knew us. He might have described it. Told the boy things without explaining why he was telling him. Like a map, Darius said. Like a map. They both watched the boy for a moment. We need to pull the archive, Malachi said. Darius nodded. The archive was a physical collection. Not digital. Never digital. Photographs, contact sheets, paper records from the years before they'd learned better than to trust anything that could be hacked or traced. It lived in a locked cabinet in Malachi's room, which was where he went now. In the kitchen, Zion set a plate of apple slices and cold rice in front of Kairo. He sat down across the counter from him. Kairo ate without rushing. Not like a child who'd been starved, but like a child who'd been taught to be grateful for food. You're not scared of us, Zion said. Kairo looked up, chewed, swallowed. Should I be? Most people are. The boy considered this seriously. My dad told me that people who are used to being feared are mostly just used to being alone, he said. He said being scary and being dangerous are different things. He looked at Zion with those steady blue eyes. He said you were dangerous, but not scary. Zion was quiet for a moment. He talked about us specifically. Sometimes, Kairo said. Not with names. Just the 3 brothers. He ate another piece of apple. He said if I ever met them I'd know. Because they all look the same but they're all different inside. Zion studied the child's face. The red hair. The blue eyes. There was nothing in the physical features that connected the boy to any of them. They were mixed black, dark-featured, built from a different bloodline entirely. But the scent was undeniable. The comfort was undeniable. The way the boy had gravitated toward Darius in the street and now sat across from Zion with both elbows on the counter, perfectly at ease in a space he had never entered before tonight, eating fruit at 1 in the morning like it was a regular Tuesday in a home he'd always known. Malachi came back into the kitchen. He set an old photograph on the counter. It was a contact print from 15 years ago. Shot in low light, slightly grainy, the edges curled from age. It showed the aftermath of a meeting, nothing formal, just a group standing near a shipping container. Malachi was in it and Darius and Zion. All 3 of them were younger in it. Harder in the way young men are hard before life rounds them. And in the corner of the photograph, half turned away from the camera, was a figure holding something. A baby, wrapped in a coat against the cold. The figure's face was only partially visible, but the red hair caught even the low-quality film's light. The baby in the coat had red hair too. They all looked at Kairo. Kairo had gone still. He was looking at the photograph. His face was open and unguarded, and for the first time since they'd found him, something moved through his expression that wasn't calm. It was complicated. Old in the way that grief gets old when a child carries it for a long time without knowing what to call it. That's my dad, Kairo said quietly. He didn't ask if it was. He didn't guess. He said it like a certainty. And then he looked up at the 3 brothers around him. And he asked a question that none of them were ready for. Did you know him before? None of them answered immediately. Zion set his hands on the counter. Malachi stood very still. Darius turned toward the window and looked out at the harbor lights below, his back to the room, his reflection faint in the glass. Kairo waited. He did that, waited without pressure, without fidgeting, like he understood that some answers needed space to form. Yes, Zion said finally. We knew him. Kairo nodded once, slowly. He knew you were going to be at that stop tonight, the boy said. It wasn't a question. It looks that way, Zion said. Then he planned for tonight, Kairo said. Before it happened. He looked down at his hands on the counter. He plans ahead. He always plans ahead. Something passed over his face. Not fear exactly, but the shape of something that fear would become if given more time. When he plans ahead like that, it usually means he was worried about something. He looked up at Zion. Is he in trouble? Zion held eye contact with the boy and answered honestly, because the boy deserved that. We don't know yet. Kairo nodded again, accepted it, filed it away. In the living room, Malachi was already on his phone. Discreet, efficient. 2 calls in 10 minutes, both short, both leaving the other party with clear instructions that produced no argument. The Valerik network had people everywhere in this city. Finding out what had happened tonight at whatever location Rowan Beaumont Ashford had been working out of was not going to take long. Darius was still at the window. He was thinking about 15 years ago. Doing the math again, the way the mind returns to a calculation it hasn't finished. He'd been 20 then. The conflict between the Eastern and Western factions had been running for 2 years, and they'd been caught on the wrong side of a checkpoint on the worst possible night. 3 brothers with no allies in reach and 2 armed parties closing in from opposite ends of the docks. And then a young Omega runner had appeared out of nowhere with a forged transit pass and an intimate knowledge of every service corridor in the harbor district. He'd moved them through in under an hour. He'd refused payment. He'd said only, "Don't make it mean nothing." Then he was gone. They'd looked for him afterward. Seriously looked. For the better part of 2 years. Nothing. The neutral faction he'd run for had dissolved. The people who might have known his full name were dead or disappeared. They'd held on to a partial name. Beaumont, someone had said once, maybe, and eventually they'd filed it away under the category of debts they owed that they might never get to repay. And now his son was sitting at their kitchen counter eating cold rice at 1 in the morning. Darius turned from the window. Kairo had finished eating. He was sitting quietly, his backpack next to the stool, watching Malachi pace the far end of the room on the phone with the focused observation of someone who finds adults interesting to study. "Can I ask you something?" Darius said, coming to sit at the counter next to him. Kairo looked up. "Sure. Did your dad teach you things? Specific things? Like how to navigate this neighborhood?" Kairo thought about it. "He taught me a lot of things," he said carefully. "He always said knowing where to go and who to trust are the most important things a person can learn." He paused. "He taught me about the stop on Harbor Street when I was really little. He made me say it back to him a lot of times so I'd remember it." "Did he say why?" "He said in case something happened and I needed to find the safest place in the city." Kairo looked at Darius directly. "He said the safest place I could ever be was wherever those 3 brothers were." Darius held very still. The safest place I could ever be. A man had spent 15 years carrying the memory of 3 people who once helped him through the worst night of his own life. And he'd turned that memory into a compass point for his child. Not an emergency number. Not an address. Not an institution. Them. He trusted them with his son without ever speaking to them. Without ever knowing if they were still the same men. Without any guarantee except whatever it was he'd seen in them 15 years ago on a dark dock in the middle of a war. Malachi came back and crouched beside Kairo. "We're going to find out what happened tonight," he said. Direct. No softening because the boy hadn't asked to be softened. "While we're doing that, you're going to stay here. Warm. Safe. Okay?" Kairo looked at him. "Okay," he said. Then he did something that none of them were prepared for. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small pendant on a plain cord. Not silver. Not expensive. Just a worn piece of dark metal about the size of a thumbnail. He held it out and looked at it for a moment, then held it toward Malachi. Malachi looked down at it. His chest went tight. The pendant was engraved with a symbol. Small. Simple. A triple arc over a line, the way sailors once marked a passage completed. An old piece of imagery that had belonged to their grandfather, and then their father, and now lived in a few specific places in their private collection. It was not a public symbol. It was not findable anywhere. It was theirs. "My dad gave me this," Kairo said. "He said it would keep me safe." He turned it over in his fingers. "He said it's very old and very important, and I should never give it to anyone I don't trust." He looked up at Malachi. "Can you hold it tonight? In case those men come back and try to take it." Malachi closed his hand around the pendant. He looked at Zion. Zion looked at Darius. The realization moved through all three of them at the same time. Not surprise exactly. More like the feeling of understanding something that had been true for a long time but had just become visible. Rowan Beaumont Ashford had not just trusted them with his son. He had trusted them with his most important possession. He had planned every detail of this night. The stop, the pendant, the things he told the boy, the things he didn't, with a precision that suggested he had seen tonight coming from a very long distance. Which meant tonight wasn't an accident. Which meant whatever had happened to Rowan was not random. Kairo looked at Zion with those quiet blue eyes, and asked, in the soft voice of a child who has been brave all night and is just now reaching the edge of it, "If my father never comes, can I still stay here?" The harbor lights shimmered through the rain on the windows. Nobody answered. Not yet. But Zion looked at the boy for a long moment. And something moved behind his eyes that hadn't been there since they were very young. Something that felt uncomfortably and unmistakably like home. The pendant was still in Malachi's hand when Kairo fell asleep. It happened fast, the way it does with children. One minute he was sitting upright at the kitchen counter finishing his food, and the next his head had dropped forward onto his folded arms and he was out completely. His breathing slowed. His shoulders dropped. Whatever he'd been carrying through the night. The rain, the long wait, the men in the service lane, all of it. Released from his body the second it decided he was safe enough to stop. Zion carried him to the couch without waking him. He was light, smaller than you'd expect when you picked him up. Zion set him down carefully, pulled a blanket from the storage bench near the window, and draped it over him. Kairo shifted once and went still. Malachi stood in the middle of the living room, watching. Darius was at the kitchen island, elbows on the counter, staring at nothing. For a long moment none of them spoke. The harbor was quiet outside the windows. The rain had thinned to a mist. The city below was doing what cities did at 2 in the morning, running on skeleton mode, just the lights and the water and the hum of something that never fully slept. "He knew the cabinet," Darius finally said. "Yes," Malachi said. "He's never been here." "No." Darius looked at him. Then Rowan described this place to him. In detail. Enough detail that a 7-year-old could walk in and find the right cabinet on the first try. Malachi turned the pendant over in his fingers. "Rowan was here before," he said. "At some point, he was in this building. That landed. Because the penthouse had been their residence for 9 years. Nobody visited without an invitation. Nobody knew the interior layout without having been inside. And the list of people who had ever been inside was short, controlled, and reviewed every year. Rowan Beaumont Ashford was not on that list. Which meant he had been inside without them knowing. Not to steal. Not to surveil. He'd had 15 years of opportunity to use whatever he knew against them and had used none of it. He'd been inside, probably once, probably years ago, and he'd memorized it, stored it, and then quietly, carefully, he'd built the memory into his son like a gift, an inheritance, a way in. Darius straightened up from the counter. He was protecting himself, he said. Or protecting Kairo. Or both. He was building options, Malachi said, in case he needed somewhere safe to send the boy in a hurry. Zion, who had been silent since putting Kairo down, said, "The pendant." Both brothers looked at him. "He gave the boy our family crest," Zion said. He kept his voice even, but the weight underneath it was clear. Not a copy, not something similar. The actual symbol, the triple arc. He paused. He knew what that was. He knew what it meant to us. And he chose to give it to his child. Nobody had an immediate answer for that. Malachi set the pendant on the coffee table. The three of them looked at it. The engraving caught the low light of the room. Small and plain and old. It had belonged to their grandfather, who had been a man of very little money and very specific values, and who had pressed it into Malachi's hand when Malachi was 12 and said, "This is what we are, not what we have. Don't confuse the two." The idea that Rowan Beaumont Ashford had obtained this symbol, had known to obtain it, had understood what it meant, was not something that could be explained by coincidence. Darius moved to the couch where Kairo was sleeping and crouched beside it. He looked at the boy's face, relaxed now, completely unguarded in sleep, red hair spread out against the cushion. He studied the features quietly for a moment. "He's been alone before," Darius said. The others looked at him. "The way he handled tonight," Darius said. "He didn't panic. He didn't cry. He sat at that bus stop in a rainstorm by himself for God knows how long. And when 3 strangers showed up, he asked if they were waiting too." He shook his head slowly. "That's not a child who is used to everything being fine. That's a child who has been taught how to be okay when things are not." The room was quiet for a moment. Zion said, "Rowan prepared him for the possibility of being alone. He prepared him for the possibility of losing his father," Malachi said. That was the sentence none of them had said yet. He sat in the room now, taking up space. Rowan Beaumont Ashford had not just planned one emergency night. He had built a whole contingency life into his son. A scent marker, a family symbol, a location. 3 names without names attached, just the 3 brothers and a harbor stop, and the instruction to wait there if everything went wrong. He had done all of that because at some point, at some quiet moment between then and now, he had looked at his life and understood that the worst could happen. And he'd decided that if it did, the safest hands his son could be in were theirs. Darius stood up from beside the couch. He looked at his brothers. Nobody said the obvious thing out loud, because some decisions don't need to be spoken to be made. They had been made the moment Kairo looked up at them at the bus stop, and made again the moment he took Darius's hand in the service lane, and made a third time when he walked into their home like he was walking into something he had always been coming toward. Malachi picked the pendant back up. He held it carefully. He looked at Kairo sleeping. And then he did something that Zion and Darius would both remember for a long time after. He closed his fist around the pendant. Not to take it. To keep it safe. Until Kairo needed it back. The papers arrived at 9 in the morning. Not slipped under the door. Not delivered quietly. A courier came to the building's front desk. Signed. Documented. Official. The kind of delivery designed to look like it couldn't be ignored. Darius took them upstairs. Kairo was awake by then, sitting at the kitchen counter again, eating toast with the careful attention of someone who took food seriously. He had found the bathroom on his own, washed his face, and rebraided a loose section of his hair with a small elastic he'd had in his backpack pocket. He looked, for all the world, like someone who lived there. Darius set the papers on the counter without opening them and went to find Malachi. They read them together in Malachi's room. Took 4 minutes. Guardianship claim. Filed 48 hours ago. A private family services firm representing a man named Clarence DeVore, identified as a long-standing associate of Rowan Beaumont Ashford and citing emergency custodial rights under a pre-existing agreement. The documentation was dense, professional, the kind of paperwork that cost significant money to produce. It was also, Malachi knew within the first 2 pages, mostly fabricated. The details were too clean, the timeline too convenient. 48 hours ago meant this had been filed before last night. Before Kairo showed up at the harbor stop. Before whatever happened to Rowan happened. Someone had known this was coming. "DeVore," Zion said from the doorway. He'd read it over Malachi's shoulder in under a minute. The name is a placeholder, Malachi said. Someone had a real person file this so there'd be a face attached. But the firm, he pointed to the bottom of the first page. 3 Bridges Family Services. That's a ghost company. It's been active for 8 months. It has a clean public record and nothing else. Someone set it up specifically, Darius said. For this, Malachi finished. They looked at each other. Zion said it first. This wasn't about Kairo until it was necessary. This was a contingency. Same as Rowan's plan, except running in the opposite direction. That mattered. Pause on that, because what it meant was that someone else had also anticipated this night. Someone else had also looked at the shape of what was coming and prepared for it. They had done it with lawyers and paperwork and a ghost company instead of a pendant and a harbor stop and a child who knew which cabinet held the cups. But the intent was the same. Get the boy. Whoever filed this guardianship claim wanted Kairo, and they wanted him with documentation that would hold up long enough to matter. Darius left the room. He came back 40 seconds later and stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, leaning against the frame. He looked at Malachi and said nothing for a moment. Just looked at him the way brothers look at each other when they are both thinking the same difficult thing and neither wants to be the first to say it out loud. How long has he been inside? Darius said finally. Not asking Malachi, asking the air. Long enough to know the right questions to ask, Malachi said. Long enough to watch us and learn our patterns without us noticing. He paused. Long enough to know about Rowan. That was the part that sat hardest. Because knowing about Rowan meant having access to old records. Deep records. The kind that didn't exist in any digital system but lived in physical archives and in the memory of people who had been around in the early years, before the organization had formalized, back when it was 3 brothers and a handful of loyal men moving carefully through a city that was not yet theirs. Someone had dug into that history. Someone had been patient and thorough and quiet about it, and then had used what they found as a mechanism. He ran the firm through 4 separate searches, cross-referenced against 2 private databases their network maintained, and found the thread in 11 minutes. 3 Bridges Family Services had been registered in Delaware. The registered agent was a law firm. That law firm had one visible corporate client in common with another entity when you traced the billing addresses 3 layers deep. That entity was a logistics and transport company called Aldrich Group. Aldrich Group was a subsidiary of their own network. Nobody said anything for a long moment. The room felt like the air had changed temperature. Someone inside, Zion said. Flat. Certain. Someone with enough access to know about Rowan, Malachi said. Enough to know the timeline. Enough to study the Beaumont-Ashford connection and trace it back to the harbor stop rotation. Enough to build a legal structure around it before the night even happened. And enough to send those men to the harbor stop, Darius said. 3 Bridges was the paperwork. Carver Network was the ground team. They were working together. For the same client, Zion said. Malachi closed the laptop. He stood up and walked to the window, looked out at the harbor. The water was gray this morning, the mist still sitting low over it. A container ship was moving slowly north along the channel. This was designed to weaken us, he said. Not just to take the boy. He turned around. Taking the boy was step 1. Step 2 was using him. If they had Kairo, they had leverage. Over us once we started looking for him. Over Rowan if he's still alive. Over whoever in the organization they're trying to move against. Darius looked at him. Step 3. We were never supposed to get to step 3, Malachi said. Because Kairo was never supposed to reach us. From the kitchen, faint and ordinary. The sound of toast being eaten. Kairo completely unaware. Safe. For now. Malachi pulled up the internal directory on his phone. He scrolled slowly, methodically, the way he did everything. Names he had known for years. Men and women who had sat across tables from him in operational meetings, who had shaken his hand at events, who had been trusted with information that moved money and people and decisions across 6 states. People who understood the rotation schedule on Harbor Street. People with the reach to commission both a legal filing and a street-level pickup team operating under different names and cover different enough that neither knew the other existed until they were both needed on the same night. He scrolled until he found a name. He stopped, stared at it. His jaw tightened in a way that it very rarely did. He turned the phone around and showed it to Zion. Zion looked at the name. He said nothing. He handed the phone to Darius. Darius read it. Then he set the phone face down on the desk and stood very still for a moment. "How long?" he said. "Not a question." "Long enough," Malachi said. "Long enough to build all of this." In the kitchen, Kairo asked the empty room if there was more bread. And the three brothers stood in the back room of their own home, looking at the name of the person who had tried to use a 7-year-old child as a weapon against them. They didn't move on it immediately. That was discipline. That was 15 years of learning that the most dangerous thing a person could do when they were angry was act at the speed of the anger. Malachi made 2 calls. Short. He spoke in the way he spoke when the other party had no option but to comply. When he finished the second call, he set his phone on the desk and looked at the wall for 30 seconds. Then he walked back to the kitchen. Kairo was at the counter. He had finished his toast and was now drawing something on the back of a receipt he'd found in his backpack pocket. He drew with focused intensity, tongue pressed slightly to the corner of his mouth, the way children draw when they are entirely inside the thing they are making. "What are you drawing?" Malachi asked. Kairo looked up. "The harbor stop," he said. "From last night. I'm trying to remember exactly where the lights were." Malachi sat down across from him. He looked at the drawing. It was surprisingly detailed for a 7-year-old. The shape of the shelter, the angle of the streetlight, 3 tall figures on one side, 1 small figure on the other, a transparent oval above the small figure that was clearly meant to be the umbrella. Malachi looked at the drawing for a long time. "You're good at that," he said. Kairo looked at it critically. "The umbrella is wrong," he said. "It was more see-through in real life." Darius came in from the hallway. He sat down on the other side of Kairo without ceremony, the way someone sits when they have decided that whatever needs to happen next needs to happen here, in this room, with this child present. "Kairo," he said, "we need to talk to you about something. And I want you to know that whatever we tell you, you're safe here. That part is decided. It's not a question." Kairo set down his pen. He looked at Darius with the full attention that 7-year-olds give when they know something real is coming. "Okay," he said. "Your dad knew some people who wanted to hurt him," Darius said. "Not because of anything he did wrong. Because of something he knew. And because of something he had, which is you." He kept his voice steady and level and honest. "Last night those people tried to take you. We stopped them. But they're not going to stop trying just because of last night." Kairo nodded slowly. "Is my dad okay?" "We're trying to find that out right now," Darius said. The boy nodded again. He processed things in these long, quiet nods, like each one was a step in a staircase he was climbing. "Are you going to protect me?" he asked. "Yes," Darius said. No hesitation. No qualifications. Kairo looked at him for a moment, then at Malachi, then at Zion, who had come to stand in the kitchen doorway. "My dad said you would," Kairo said. "He said if it ever came to this, you wouldn't need to be asked. He said that was how he knew you were the right people." Zion felt something tighten behind his sternum, because Rowan Beaumont Ashford had said that from a distance, from a life he'd built quietly and separately and carefully, far enough from them that he couldn't know for certain anymore who they'd become in 15 years. He'd said it anyway. He had trusted them with his son based on who they were in one bad night a long time ago. And the weight of that trust was heavier than anything any of them had been handed in a long time. Malachi leaned forward. He looked at Kairo directly. "We already let your father down once," he said. It was a hard sentence to say. He said it anyway because the boy deserved the truth of it and because half-truths with children have a way of growing into full ones later in the worst possible moments. "A long time ago, when he helped us, we should have stayed in contact. We should have made sure he was okay. We didn't. We lost track of him, and we let too much time go by, and we told ourselves it was fine because nothing visible had gone wrong yet." Kairo was very still. Something bad is happening now, Malachi said. And part of why it's happening is because we weren't watching. His voice was even, but the edges of it had something in them that wasn't evenness. We're not going to make that mistake again. Kairo looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up his pen. He added something to the drawing. 3 more figures, slightly larger than the ones already there, standing closer to the small figure with the umbrella. He turned it around and showed it to Malachi. That's all of us, he said. Together. Malachi looked at the drawing. He looked at it for longer than necessary. Then he said, very quietly, yeah, that's all of us. In Malachi's room, the phone was face down on the desk with a name on its screen. A name that had been inside their organization for years. A name that had watched them, learned them, and then used what it knew to try to take this child apart from the only safe place he had left. They were not going to be loud about what happened next. They were not going to be fast about it. But they were going to be thorough. And by the time they were finished, the person behind that name would have nothing left to operate with. They had failed Rowan Beaumont Ashford once. Not through cruelty. Not through indifference. Through the ordinary carelessness of people who have survived something and moved on and told themselves that moving on was the same as being fine. It wasn't the same. They knew that now. They had made the promise now, to a 7-year-old with red hair and a cheap umbrella and a drawing that had all of them in it. This time they would not fail. They moved carefully. That's the thing about men who have operated in the dark for a long time. They know that noise is a liability. Speed is a liability. Visible anger is the worst liability of all, because it tells your opponent exactly how much they've cost you. The Valerick brothers gave nothing away. Over the next 3 weeks, Malachi worked through 3 layers of the organization's financial architecture. Quietly, without announcement, the way you drain water from a building without anyone noticing the floor is getting drier. Every account Aldrich Group had ever touched was flagged. Every transaction connected to Three Bridges Family Services was documented, time-stamped, and handed off to a federal contact they had maintained at arm's length for 11 years for exactly the kind of night when something needed to leave their hands and enter a larger system. The federal contact asked no unnecessary questions. He took the documents. He made 2 calls of his own. By the end of the 2nd week, Three Bridges Family Services had been frozen. By the end of the 3rd, its registered agent had been called before a grand jury and 2 of the Carver Network senior operators had been arrested in connection with a trafficking investigation that had, officially, nothing to do with the Valerick brothers at all. The name on Malachi's phone screen, Theo Bancroft Osei, a logistics director who had sat 12 feet from Darius in operational meetings for 6 years, resigned quietly on a Tuesday morning. His resignation letter cited personal reasons. He was gone from the building by noon. He didn't disappear. That was deliberate. Disappearing would have created questions. Disappearing would have made a story. What happened to Theo Bancroft Osei was quieter and more complete than disappearing. His access was removed, his network was severed, his name was withdrawn from every project he'd touched, and he was left with nothing except the knowledge of how close he had come and how completely it had not worked. Sometimes that's worse. Zion thought it was worse. He didn't lose sleep over it. Through all of it, the calls, the documents, the careful dismantling, Kairo was in the penthouse. He was not in danger, and after the first few days he seemed to understand that. The wariness that had lived just under the surface of his calm in those first nights began to loosen. He started leaving his backpack by the door instead of keeping it on his person. He started sleeping past 6 in the morning instead of waking at the first sound in the apartment. He started laughing. That was the thing that none of the brothers were fully prepared for. They had managed danger. They had managed logistics. They had managed the specific and heavy grief of a child who did not know yet where his father was. They had not prepared for the laughter. Kairo laughed at small things. At the way Darius mispronounced a word he'd clearly been saying wrong for years. At a show on television that he watched with his knees pulled to his chest and his face completely open. At a joke Zion made once, badly, awkwardly, in the stilted way of a man who didn't make jokes often. That was genuinely not that funny, But Kairo laughed anyway and kept laughing, and that laugh produced, against all expectations, a real one from Zion. Malachi heard it from the next room. He stood very still for a moment, listening to his brother laugh. Zion hadn't laughed like that in years. Maybe longer. 3 weeks in, Kairo began calling them by name without any of the small hesitations that had marked the early days. The half-second pauses where a child checks whether familiarity is acceptable before using it. He just used their names. Comfortable. Easy. Like he'd always known them. He still waited near the window some evenings. Not every evening. Just some. He would sit sideways in the wide armchair by the harbor-facing window and look out at the water and the lights. And none of the brothers pressed him about it or asked him to come away from it. They understood what he was doing. He was keeping space open, holding a door ajar, in case. One evening Zion sat near him while he watched the harbor. Not right next to him. Just in the same room, reading, close enough that the silence was shared rather than separate. After a while, Kairo said, "Do you think he's watching the water too?" Zion looked up from his book. "Wherever he is," Kairo said. "Do you think he looks at the water sometimes and thinks about us?" Zion held his answer for a moment. He chose it carefully. "Yes," he said. "I think that's exactly what he does." Kairo looked out at the harbor. "Me too," he said. Outside, the city moved on in its ordinary way. The lights, the ships, the low hum of a million people living their lives. Ordinary. Endless. Indifferent to the small specific wait of a child waiting by a window. Then, on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks and 4 days after the night it all began, a message arrived. Not to a phone. Not to an email address. It arrived in the way messages arrived when someone wanted to be certain it would be seen and not traced. Through a courier to the building's front desk, in a sealed envelope with no return address, with the building's address written by hand in ink that had dried clean and careful. Darius brought it upstairs. He set it on the kitchen table. The 3 brothers stood around it for a moment. Kairo was in the living room watching his show. Malachi opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No letterhead. No date. No signature. 1 sentence. He read it once. Then he read it again. Then he passed it to Zion. The paper said, "Thank you for protecting my son." That was it. No location. No name. No instructions. No promise of contact. Just those 7 words in the same careful, clean handwriting as the address on the envelope. Zion read it twice. He passed it to Darius. Darius read it and set it down on the table and stood with both hands flat on the surface, looking at the paper for a long moment without speaking. The message had no sender attached, but it had a sender. They all knew it. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, the kind of handwriting a person produces when they are writing something important and want each word to carry exactly its right weight. Not rushed, not shaking. Rowan Beaumont Ashford was alive. That was what the paper meant. Alive and mobile enough to send something through a courier, and careful enough to leave no trace, and close enough to know that the message would reach them. Alive. They let that settle. In the living room, Kairo's show played on. The sound of it came through the doorway. Music, then a voice, then a small laugh from the armchair. Malachi took the paper from Darius. He folded it once, carefully, along its original crease. He walked to the living room. Kairo looked up from the armchair. He read something in Malachi's face, not alarm but significance. Children are excellent at reading rooms. This child especially. "What?" Kairo said. Malachi sat down on the couch across from him. He set the folded paper on the cushion beside him and looked at Kairo for a moment. "We got a message," he said. Kairo went very still. "From your dad," Malachi said. Something moved through Kairo's face that was not easily named. It started somewhere behind his eyes and moved outward. Relief and grief and joy and the complicated specific feeling of something you had been holding your breath for finally arriving. All of it at once, in the face of a child who had been carrying it quietly for weeks. He didn't cry immediately. He just said, "Is he okay?" "We think so," Malachi said. "We don't know where he is, but he found a way to reach us, which means he's moving." He's thinking. He's being careful, Kairo said. Yes, Malachi said. Exactly that. Kairo looked at the folded paper. Can I see it? Malachi handed it to him. Kairo unfolded it slowly. He read it. Read it again. His jaw moved slightly. Then he folded it back along the crease and held it in both hands, looking at it. He wrote it himself, Kairo said. Not a question. He recognized the handwriting. Yes, Malachi said. Kairo held the paper against his chest. He closed his eyes for a moment. One breath in, one breath out. Then he opened his eyes and looked at Malachi with something that was calmer and more settled than anything he'd shown in all the weeks since that rainy night at the harbor stop. He knows we're okay, Kairo said. Yes, Malachi said. And he's okay, Kairo said. Yes. Kairo nodded once, long and slow, the way he always processed things that mattered. He looked out at the harbor through the window. The water was dark tonight, moving, catching the lights of the city in the way water does. 1,000 small reflections that added up to something larger than any one of them. He'll come back, Kairo said. When it's safe. Nobody contradicted him. Because they believed it too. The weeks that followed were quieter than any of them expected. Not empty, not simple, but quiet in the way that things become quiet when the danger is gone and what's left is ordinary life, which turns out to be its own kind of weight. Full and specific and worth carrying. Kairo enrolled in school. Darius drove him the first day, which required a level of patience with parking that Darius did not naturally possess and which Kairo found very funny. Zion made breakfast on weekday mornings. Not because anyone asked him to. Just because he was up early and the kitchen was there and Kairo ate more when someone made the food than when it was just left out. Malachi helped with homework. He had not expected to be good at that. He was surprisingly good at that. The pendant sat in a small dish on the kitchen counter. Not hidden, not stored, just there. Present. Kairo looked at it sometimes. He didn't seem to need to hold it anymore. He seemed to understand that what it represented was not something that could be taken from him. Some evenings Kairo still sat by the harbor window. Less often now, but still. He was not waiting the same way he had waited at the bus stop in the rain. That waiting had been alone, held together by instructions and a child's stubborn refusal to give up on the person who had given them. This waiting was different. It was patient, easy. Held up from underneath by people on all sides of it. He was not waiting alone anymore. That was the difference. That was everything. Zion was the one who received the second message, 2 months later. Not a paper this time. A clean, brief, and signed email through a channel they hadn't used in years. A channel only 3 people in the world knew still existed. One of those people was Malachi. One was Darius. And the third, it turned out, was Rowan Beaumont Ashford, who had apparently memorized it alongside everything else he had kept, quietly and precisely, across 15 years of careful living. The message said only moving north, slower than planned. Watching, that was all. Zion read it once. Then he walked to the living room where Kairo was drawing. He was always drawing now, filling whole notebooks with the careful detailed images of a child who processed the world through his hands. Zion sat on the couch. He didn't say anything immediately. Kairo looked up. Is it my dad? Zion looked at him. How do you always know? He said. Kairo shrugged. Your face is different, he said. When it's something about him, your face does a thing. Zion was quiet for a moment. Moving north, he said. Slower than planned. But moving. Kairo looked at him for a long moment. Then he went back to drawing. Zion watched him. Kairo was drawing the harbor again. He drew it often. The water, the lights, the long reach of the dock. He drew it from the window's viewpoint now, from above, looking down from the place where they lived. Not from the street. Not from the bus stop. From here. From home. Months passed. Kairo grew a little. Not much, children don't grow that fast in short spans of time. But enough that Darius noticed his shoes needed to be replaced and felt something strange and warm about having noticed. Zion fixed the loose cabinet hinge in the kitchen that had been bothering him since they moved in. because Kairo had mentioned it 3 times with the specific and polite persistence of a child who doesn't want to complain but can't help noticing things. Malachi taught him to play cards. Kairo beat him by the 3rd session, which Malachi refused to believe until Kairo did it twice more. The city kept moving. The harbor kept running. The organization kept operating, leaner now, tighter, the rod of Theo Bancroftos's network removed and the space around it closed carefully. Not perfect. Nothing was ever perfect. But cleaner. Safer. Then one evening in late spring, months after the rain, months after the harbor stop, months after the paper with 7 words on it, the front desk of the building called up to the penthouse. Darius answered. He listened. He set the phone down. He stood very still for a moment in the kitchen, both hands on the counter, looking at the tile. From the living room, Kairo's voice. "Who was that?" Darius turned around. He looked at the boy sitting on the floor of the living room with a notebook in his lap and a pencil behind his ear, looking back at him with those steady blue eyes. Darius said, "Someone's downstairs." Kairo went still. "Who?" he said. Darius looked at him for a long moment. "He says his name is Rowan," Darius said. "And he says he's sorry it took so long." Nobody moved for a second. Then Kairo was off the floor. He was at the elevator before Darius had fully registered he'd stood up. He hit the button and stood in front of the doors with both hands at his sides, breathing fast, staring at the numbers above the doors as they counted upward from the lobby. The 3 brothers stood back. This wasn't theirs. The elevator opened. A man stepped out. Lean, cautious-eyed, moving with the specific careful economy of someone who had spent a long time being very aware of every space he entered. Red hair, darker than his son's. A scar below his left eye that hadn't been there 15 years ago. A coat that had clearly been through more than this one season. He looked at the 3 brothers first. Just a moment. A look that carried everything. The 15 years, the debt, the trust, the apology, the gratitude. All of it in a single second before his eyes moved. Then he looked down at his son. Kairo hit him like a small freight train. Both arms around his middle, face buried in his father's coat. No sound at first. Just the total, absolute, body-filling relief of a child who had been brave for a very long time and had finally been given permission to stop. Rowan's arms closed around him. He held on. He held on the way you hold on when you have been running and afraid and separated from the person you were most afraid of losing, and now they are here and they are real, and everything you told yourself while you were running, that they were safe, that it would be okay, that the right people had them, turned out to be true. He held on and said something quiet into the top of his son's head that none of the brothers could hear. Kairo pulled back just far enough to look up at his father's face. He touched the scar below his eye. "You're okay," Kairo said. "I'm okay," Rowan said. "You were moving north," Kairo said. "Slower than planned." Rowan blinked, looked past his son at the 3 brothers. Darius gave a small shrug. "We told him," he said. "Not everything, but enough." Rowan looked at his son. "Yeah," he said. "I was moving north. Slower than planned." He held the boy tighter for a moment. "But I got here." The harbor lights moved through the windows. The city below kept its ordinary, endless motion. The 3 brothers stood back, giving space, holding the room, doing the thing they had learned in the months since a rainy night that they were surprisingly, unexpectedly capable of. Just being present without needing to control anything. At some point Zion moved to the kitchen. He put water on, because some things called for warmth, and warmth was what he had. Malachi and Darius stood near the window. Malachi looked at the harbor. He thought about a man who had chosen to trust them before he had any proof they deserved it, who had built a compass point for his child and pointed it in their direction without telling them and without asking permission and without any guarantee except the memory of who they had been on one terrible night a long time ago. And he thought about the fact that Rowan hadn't been wrong. Below, somewhere at the edge of the city's long coast, the water moved, cold and dark and continuous, the way it had been since before any of them existed and would be long after. The kettle began to build toward a whistle. Kairo laughed at something his father said, and Malachi let himself feel something he had not felt in longer than he could precisely calculate. He let himself feel like enough, like what they were, what they had become. In the months since a small boy with a plastic umbrella asked if they were also waiting for someone was enough. More than enough. It turned out the answer to that question, the one Kairo had asked them in the rain, had always been yes. They had been waiting. They just hadn't known what for. Now they did. If the story moved something in you, if you've ever waited for someone to come back, or been the one who finally made it home, drop it in the comments. Tell us. Your story matters more than you think. And if you want to be here for what comes next on this channel, stories that hit different, stories that stay with you, hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Every new story is a reason to come back. Share this one with someone who needs it right now. You never know who's sitting by a window waiting for something to remind them they're not alone. We'll see you in the next one.